can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. I want to use this episode today to discuss a little bit from my own back garden, I suppose, insofar as motivational theory. I want to actually try to expand the language that we use to categorise different dimensions of motivational coach behaviour. So I suppose to offer a little bit of brief context here, anyone who's familiar with self-determination theory been used to hearing the phrase of environmental structures that the coach is quite heavily involved in that either enhance or frustrate players or an athlete, depending on what sport you're in, how you define that, that will enhance or frustrate their perceived psychological need satisfaction, and that can be across 3 dimensions insofar as autonomy. In other words, the extent to which they feel in control of their behaviour and the extent to which they feel they can move forward in their behaviour volitionally, in a sense that's sort of self-integrating and has been internally driven, and also sort of rather their perception of competence, so the extent to which they feel they can engage with their environment, so actually get good at something, that sort of get closer towards a level of perceived mastery in a sport, which is really important. Insofar as maybe want to do a sport for longer or do any activity for longer for that. And by that extension, if you're getting better at something, ultimately that makes you feel more motivated in some ways, or have a richer quality of motivation rather. I'd be more specific here because we're dealing with not just the amount of motivation someone possesses, but also the quality of their motivation. So that's really important. And then we've also got behaviour that affects, either in a way that's seen as actively supporting or actively frustrating, or indeed another word for this would be thwarting. Just a bit of a silly fancy word that we use, but yeah, frustrating is maybe a better way of just coining it there. Frustrating the need for relatedness, which is the third of these 3 sort of basic psychological needs that everyone's sort of, according to an STD lens, is posited to possess, and that we need as coaches to support. So, and that need for relatedness could also be seen as sort of interpersonal connection that we have with other people, to feel a sense of being cared for, and actually, as well as that, to feel like you care for other people. So it's that feeling of community, if you want to call it that as well. Again, as I say, they're the sort of loose. They're the 2 main categories that are out there. Okay, in the way that we can evaluate behaviour, in the way that we can sort of understand different features of behaviour that is seen. And I'm going to try, and I say this, I'm going to try and park some of my grievances with self-determination theory in this episode. That could be for a later conversation, but seen according to the literature and according to what some of the empirical evidence would point towards, we categorise the behaviours in the sense of what is seen to be damaging and that we should avoid, and what is seen to be supportive, i.e. supportive of psychological needs, and what is seen therefore for it is always encouraged as being the more optimal way of facilitating quite a more adaptive motivational environment as a coach. So those are the sort of 2 main ways that we look at behaviour in a coach from a motivational lens. We either look at what's supporting psychological needs or what is frustrating them. Now, there is a missed category of behaviour in quite a lot of research today, and often I think in a lot of conversations from coach educators, coach developers, whatever, coaches themselves, in the way that they reflect on these things. And it is the category known as need depriving behaviour. So what is need deprivation or need neglecting behaviour? How is that any different from need frustration or need thwarting behaviour? And in order to sort of understand this, I'm going to start with a metaphor that I picked up from a more generally pitched topic, or more generally pitched article rather, that was written by Van Steenskete and Ryan, probably butchered that name, forgive me. So more sort of general psychology. And they spoke about the distinctions between need frustration and need deprivation and need support in this way. So if you kind of liken it to a plant, okay, so we have a plant in a pot, okay, and we water that plant consistently. So in that way, we are actively giving that plant the nutrients it needs, the nourishment it requires to grow. So we're actively supporting what the plant needs, okay? Coaches can actively support what their athletes needs. They can actively be autonomy supportive by, allowing for input and decisions, or by acknowledging their thoughts and feelings, or by giving a rationale for tasks and instructions, or by offering opportunities for them to, independently carry out work. So we can be active in doing that. So there's a conscious decision being made on the coach's part to actively support the needs. Or similarly in this sort of metaphor of the plant, to nourish the plant by actively watering it, ensuring that it has sunlight, all the things that we know help the plant grow. Because that's what self-determination theory is predicated on, this sort of sense that everyone's got an innate desire to grow, but their environmental structures need to support that around them. So we've got that side of it, okay? The contrast of that is I pour salt over the plant, okay? And this is what the article is very good at sort of painting the picture around. So or a stamp on the plant, so it's not just that I'm not nourishing it, but I'm actively conflicting with its compulsion to grow, its desire to grow naturally. Okay, I'm actually trying to damage the plant. Okay, now as coaches, hopefully not in deliberate cases, but where there's behaviours that unknowingly sometimes can have a detrimental impact on an athletes, we might, let's say autonomy, the opposite of autonomy is control. So we might command players to do things. We might, and again, let's just think of this purely through the metaphorical sense and purely from the motivational lens that he's trying to give us here before we maybe critique it. That again, we might not have time for that today, but I wanted to make the point. We might, threaten athletes with the risk of punishment, or use tangible rewards in order to get their compliance. So kids that aren't behaving well, we say, well, we'll promise them a game at the end of the training session if they behave, or they have to run laps if they don't. We would, the coach that actively sort of encourages normative comparison beyond a level that is conducive to healthy competition. We're constantly comparing athletes. In these situations, athletes stop wanting to get better because they actually, or at least the argument is in these situations that athletes stop wanting to be better, and they actually instead are more interested in just showing up and being better than other people, so that and they're controlled by that. So that's the implications of behaviours we would say be actively frustrating. So they're acting in active opposition to needs. Okay, same way coach that creates a chaotic environment, or rather not even that, but a coach that tells an athlete they aren't capable of getting any better, a coach that's constantly criticising an athlete is actively thwarting whether or not they mean it intentionally or not, but in how it's received, it's an act of frustration towards the sense of competence. The coach that, again, unintentionally or intentionally, is separating athletes from their friends, is actively being cold and distant. That coach is frustrating their need for relatedness. Okay? And that would be the equivalent, as I say, the plant being put salt on the plant. So you can either water the plant, you can put salt on it. That's the way we typically look at this conversation of supporting needs, frustrating needs. But again, as I say, there's that missing category of behaviour. And this is where we aren't throwing salt in the plant, but maybe we just aren't tending to the plant. We're watering it every now and again. It's not a lot. We're neglectful of its need for sunlight. So sometimes we maybe place it somewhere in the garden that isn't going to get as much raise as maybe elsewhere in the garden. So it's not that we're actively trying to frustrate it. We're not actively trying to kill the plant. We're not actively trying to kill the athlete's motivation, or more internalized motivation, more internally driven motivation. because that's that whole thing in self-determination theory. We believe that, across in a lot of the measurements that have been done anyway, would suggest that where there's more of an internal driver behind behaviour, that tends to lead to more adaptive outcomes. But we're just not showing enough active care towards the need to support their needs. So that's where there's this now: watering a plant, supporting it, actively throwing salt in the plant to kill it and damage its needs, to then neglecting it, but we're just not doing enough, as much as we could do to support its needs. Now, that middle behaviour is really important to acknowledge, because it's often goes underneath the radar, because it's not an obvious way of conceptualising or potentially damaging coach behaviour. And that's what's quite insidious about it, because it's a passive means of frustrating needs. So it doesn't have the same immediate impact, and it's not as immediately detrimental perhaps to longer term growth, or actually immediate term motivation or quality of motivation, engagement in a task, and try to get that kid to come back, but want to come back. As I say, I'm always careful about saying, don't just see a kid coming back or an athlete complying with what you do is necessarily showing that they want to do it, but we always need to think about why they're actually doing that. But it's not necessarily an immediate risk factor in terms of how we triage things, compared to a more active frustration and behaviours that are actively frustrating and actively thwarting and actively damaging perhaps that potential, as I say, for athletes to have internal drivers towards the behaviours. But longer term, incrementally small neglectful behaviours are going to be as damaging in some ways to an athlete's motivation for why they, the reasons why they attach to being involved in activity, and it's going to be as damaging perhaps to the longer term growth within that activity, the longer term participation within that activity. So it can achieve the same long term effects that are damaging, that can achieve the same long term damaging effects as need thwarting behaviour, but it does it in a way that's slow and passive, and for that reason is actually needs to be acknowledged, because it could be very dangerous. So let's put this into coaching terms. So coach that it's not that they're not offering support for autonomy, but they only every now and again offer athlete input. It's the coach that it's not that they're telling an athlete get lost to being really cold and distant, but they just don't always and regularly show an interest in them or in behaviours, or they don't engage in behaviours, or they show an interest in maybe the athlete's life outside of the activity. They don't show behaviours that shows interpersonal involvement that often. They don't deliberately show enthusiasm for coaching them. But it's not always deliberate. It's not always clear. They're quite negligent of, and this is the word negligent. It's like there's a difference between neglect and abuse. It's a form of abuse, but it's different in the way that we can differentiate them. They're not trying to separate friends, but they aren't always being conscious when they're planning activities about how they can maybe maximise or create a bit of a communicative element to it that pays attention to the need for kids, let's say in the youth coaching context, to have enjoyment through friendships. So it's not that they're not setting up an adequate structure, which is another word that we use. It's another word that we use for that sense of competence. It's not that they're not just being supportive of structure, given that adequate structure, as we say. It's not either that they're telling an athlete that they're rubbish and that they can't get any better. It's not that they're actively discouraging them from taking on challenges, but it's just maybe the expectations they set for how they do tasks, or the goals that they set for how the athletes should maybe, how they can get better, that they're vague. That they're just not scaffolding the environment as well as they could do. So again, does it have the same immediate impact and damaging impact potential as telling an athlete they're rubbish? No, but not scaffolding and not structuring an environment the correct way over time is going to deplete an athlete's resources and their perception of how competent they feel. And therein, as a result of that, is going to have that damaging effect, as I say, on their motivation for being there. And again, it's probably going to make it become more less extrinsic and more extrinsic, which is where we aren't doing it because we feel competent or feel in control, or we aren't doing it because we feel interpersonally involved. We're doing it for some other sort of reason around that. It's more perverted in the sense that it's that we want other people's satisfaction, or that we're doing it because our self-esteem is reliant on feeling competent, or for these reasons that aren't always as healthy. for an athlete to be experiencing. So that's why it's really, really important that we acknowledge this hidden category of behaviour, because it's almost non-existent in most of the literature. I think outside of, there was a study back in 2011 by Bartholomew and colleagues who were kind of separating psychological need thwarting from what they called need dissatisfaction. I think when they were developing and testing a questionnaire for measuring need thwarting. Honestly, from when I was doing my PhD in this area, there was no representative examples anywhere in existing literature for it that was really talking about this. And I think the self-determination theory-based literature in a sport context is a bit slow to carry forward some more modern conceptualizations that exist maybe in the more dominant general psychology literature. And then, let's say, for you guys that are listening, maybe aren't in academia and you're there as the coach, and that sort of trickle down effect, you might not be as aware of that behaviour, or might not be aware of its potentially damaging effects. Now, to put it into more context about why we need to consider that, because you might go, oh, well, maybe not always be given the most vague structuring, or maybe not always offering choice, or maybe not always, really making an active effort to put together, activities where friendship's part of the equation. That's not that big a deal. But we need to remember that if we think about these different types of behaviours, we need to recognise that coach behaviour is sometimes better seen as being, and certainly when we're talking about dimensions of motivational coach behaviour, they aren't mutually exclusive from one another. So being autonomy supportive doesn't automatically mean that you're then no longer controlling. So that you can have both sides of the coin at once. So we call this an orthogonal relationship. So, and that's why coaches need to, and where we've actually seen we've seen studies done where they've measured multiple dimensions of behaviour at once across the different categories of behaviour, the different types of behaviours that can occur. And even where an environment has, so there's a study by Appleton and Duda that found that even where an environment has elements of autonomy support, where that's the dominant trend, okay, for example, where there's a dominant trend towards motivationally supportive or adaptive behaviours, even a small amount of behaviours that aren't necessarily actively supporting the needs still has been shown to carry a risk to players' health and functioning, okay, to their well-being and all those sorts of things that we need to care about. So it's not enough to just be not controlling. It's not enough to just be not cold and isolating. It's not enough to just be creating an environment that's chaotic and is actually telling an athlete that they aren't close to mastery or they aren't, getting any better. We also have to be actively supporting things at the same time. So we both have to avoid some behaviours while actively pursuing others. Okay? And again, I'm saying that, taking off my coach's hat now, because again, as I say, it's a separate conversation for when we should be controlling to when maybe we can look to see where we maybe can afford to not be. Okay, that's sometimes a different thing. It does depend. Okay, so, but in terms of just helping you understand where the evidence is, what the evidence has been pointing towards in some respects, but where perhaps there's been a lag in how we've actually then conceptualised the multiple realities that the evidence has shown exists in the way coach behaviour actually is exhibited, that there are different things happening at once, so we need to be conscious of different aspects of behaviour that can also come out at once, even where they don't seem to go hand in hand. They don't need to, but they can still occur because our environments are going to naturally have different layers to them in that respect. So these are the things we need to be mindful of, okay? And the reason why I care a lot about this is that my PhD and a lot of my research that I've done as well around that often looks at influences on coach behaviour. And that is why, and I try to take away, and I think for the purpose of this small conversation, I try not to think about what the coach needs to keep doing right and what the coach needs to keep getting better at. I think there is an element of training for the coach that is always required when we're trying to create a better environment and from an STD standpoint, an environment that's more motivationally adaptive. But I always recognise that the coach doesn't operate in a vacuum, that when you study influences of coach behaviour, you start to understand why coaches behave in the way they do. And again, for the same reasons that I put a lot of pressure often, and I would always be more critical, more easily, of environmental factors that create the compulsion to behave in a way that maybe isn't what we would actually always want. It's that we also then, again, let's apply this language to that in a more critical frame to help out how we can understand environmental impacts on athletes through the coach. That there's more insidious, more passive, more under the radar consequences for different environmental structures that may not create behaviours that seem in a very black and white way or very bad, we need to avoid this, the coaches are under a lot of time pressures, or the coaches are under a lot of, pressures, for example, around winning matches at the weekends, so they're now behaving in a controlling way. It might not be that. That might not be that isn't the only stick to hit them with, in a sense, in terms of we're trying to push clubs to create better environments for coaches. We also need to push, I think, for clubs to recognise where what they might do and to be appraising of what they do that stops coaches from doing more. Not just what they do that causes coaches to do behaviours that they don't agree with. Because when we understand need deprivation, we understand the orthogonal nature of coaching. We understand that we need to set up an environment for coaches and also push coaches to train themselves and become better educated on this. And, we need to set up the conditions that both actively support needs while avoiding active frustration of needs. So that's just my little piece for that today. So think about that. Think about that in the context of yourself as the coach. Maybe reflect a little bit on your own behaviours in that way. And then also think about that maybe if you're operationally leading a coaching environment. And I would always encourage you to have a dialogue with coaches to start to understand what makes them tick. So you can set the conditions in a way, in whatever way you're able to support them in that sense. And think about how the impact you might have, again, as I say, extends across 3 potential categories of behaviour rather than just the black and white versions that we always see that are seeming complete opposite of one another, because there are these bits in between that are really important to consider. So, thanks guys. I hope that episode's been helpful. If anything that I've said there has landed with you, let me know. And yeah, I will see you next time.